Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. As Shannon mentioned, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And what today's session is going to be is an introduction to our work at EVP. And so hopefully you'll find it interesting. Hopefully for those of you who know a little bit about us, you'll learn a little bit more. And as Shannon mentioned, we will have a brief Q&A session at the end. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And we are going to jump right into things. So in a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just two things. One, we identify environmentalists who don't vote. And then two, we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. And so what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that a lot of other environmental organizations do. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as it might sound, try to convince people to care more about climate or environmental issues. In fact, a good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we do is we identify the people who don't need their minds changed. We identify people who care so deeply about climate or other environmental issues that it's quite literally their number one priority over all other issues. Yet, they aren't voting. And so what they need is that purely behavioral intervention. And that's where we come in. And the reason we take this very, very specific, narrow focus is as follows. There are obviously a lot of reasons why we don't consistently get strong environmental leadership, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. But perhaps the biggest one can be seen in this poll. And this poll that I'm showing you is really no different from pretty much any other poll that you might see. This is a poll of likely midterm voters that actually we commissioned at the Environmental Voter Project back in July. This is a poll in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And as you'll see, among people who are likely to vote in the upcoming midterm election, only 4% listed climate or some other environmental issue as their number one priority. And believe me, if you look nationwide or you drill down into specific states or you look in local elections, these numbers rarely differ. We're talking 4, 5, 6, maybe down to 3%. And we simply are not going to get the climate and environmental leadership that we need if so few voters list climate and other environmental issues as a top priority. Now, I want to be clear here because many of you are probably thinking, oh, well, I've heard of polls that say, a majority of Americans want this or a majority of voters want that. And you're not wrong. Huge numbers of Americans would prefer government action to address the climate crisis. They would prefer government action to invest in clean energy. But mere preferences rarely drive political campaigns and policymaking. No, what we really need to drill down on are not preferences, but priorities. What are the issues that are so important to voters that they're the number one issue, or maybe in their top 3 issues, because that is what really drives policymakers. And when we narrow down to even top 3 priorities, climate and the environment is rarely above 8, 9, 10%. And that's a problem. That's a problem because even though we in the environmental movement have enjoyed some big wins lately, They're nowhere near what we need. And believe me, things aren't going to get easier from here on out. They're only going to get harder. And so, simply put, we need more political power. We need more voters demanding climate leadership. And here is why. If there is one thing you take away from this presentation, please let it be what I'm about to say. Who you vote for is secret. I think pretty much everybody knows that on this webinar. I hope they do. But whether you vote or not, that is public record. Whether you choose to cast a ballot in any election, that is public record. And not only is it public record, it is quite literally the essential building block to how all campaigns are run and how all policy is made. And here is why. The first thing any campaign does is they sit down and they say, okay, we've got limited time and limited money, and we literally know by name and street address who is likely to vote in this election that we're trying to win and who isn't. Because again, remember what I just said, whether you vote or not in particular elections, that is public record. And if you're one of those campaigns with limited time and limited money, and your only goal is to get a majority of the votes on a Tuesday in November, and you know who usually shows up to those elections and who doesn't, well, who do you think you're going to spend your time and energy and money on? Do you think you're going to talk to all of the non-voters? No. I mean, maybe with your last dollar, you might reach out to some of them, but you're going to start with the people who have shown over and over again that they show up and actually cast a ballot in this election that you're trying to win. And so campaigns mostly target likely voters. And not to be creepy here, but like, we literally know who these people are by name and street address. And so does anybody who is running for city council or mayor or president or senator, governor, or Congress. They know who these likely voters are. And if those are the people they're most likely to reach out to, well, who do you think they're going to poll to figure out what issues they care about? They sure ain't going to poll the people who don't vote. No, they are going to poll the people who are likely to vote. And I know this sounds cynical, but it's a simple truth that this means politicians just don't care about the priorities of non-voters. They just don't. They know who the non-voters are, and they know that those people ain't going to decide who wins and loses the next election. And so, unfortunately, this is not very good news for the environmental movement, because polls like this are not secret. Any politician knows who is likely to vote in the election they're trying to win, and it is very easy to measure the preferences and, more importantly, priorities of those likely voters. And whenever you do that, whether it's for mayor of Boise, Idaho, or president of the United States, far too few of those likely voters list climate and environmental issues as a top priority. And what that means is, boy, is it hard for politicians to lead on climate. Even when we elect the so-called right people, then it's hard for them to spend their political capital on climate. I mean, even if we elect perfect climate candidates to every single position, they still end up looking at polling data like this and thinking, gosh, well, I can't just snap my fingers and get whatever I want. And so I need to decide what to spend my precious political capital on. And can I justify spending it on the thing with a 4% next to it? It's hard. It's hard. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we shouldn't elect the right people. Of course we should. But what we also need to do is we need to provide that voter demand for climate leadership. Because I think we all know it is more likely that politicians do what it takes to win elections than it is for them to do what is right out of the goodness of their heart. Boy, would I rather rely on aligning climate leadership with what's good politically. And right now, often, climate leadership is politically risky. Or if not risky, at least it's not the most obvious return on investment for their time. We don't do ourselves any favors by ignoring these numbers. The simple truth is we need more political power in the climate movement. Okay, I promise this all won't be doom and gloom. I swear to you, I swear to you. But I think it's important to set up this very big problem in the environmental movement that we simply don't have enough political power right now. All right, so when looking at this problem, why is it that we at the Environmental Voter Project decide to do this weird stuff that we focus on, finding non-voting environmentalists and turning them into better voters? Well, it's for this reason. It turns out that data like this, it turns out that data showing that so few voters list climate and the environment as their top priority is not because too few Americans care deeply about climate and the environment. In fact, if you step back and you widen your aperture and you look at a broader universe of people, so not just likely voters in a midterm or whatever election you're looking at, but instead you look at all registered voters or all adults, well then many, many more Americans end up listing climate and the environment as their top priority. In fact, it turns out there are tens of millions of them who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their #1 priority. So why aren't they showing up in polls of likely voters like this? Well, for one pretty simple reason. It turns out that environmentalists are disproportionately awful voters. The more we look at this data at the Environmental Voter Project, the more we come to realize that the environmental movement and the climate movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. There are tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists out there who, mind you, are already registered to vote. They're just not actually showing up. They're not casting ballots in elections. And I'll give you some numbers in a second. But what this means is that there is an enormous opportunity in voter turnout. There is an enormous opportunity for groups like the Environmental Voter Project and potentially interested activists and volunteers like many of you, because there's this huge pool of potential environmental political power sitting on the sidelines. And these are people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They are with us. They just need to be mobilized. And as I will suggest to you over the coming 5-10 minutes, I won't claim that's easy. It's not easy, but it is easier than changing people's minds and easier than changing their opinions. And so this is an extraordinary opportunity. But before we get into how we do this and what some of our results are, let me just tell you, because I know I just made a big assertion, which is lots of environmentalists don't vote. Let me give you some numbers on this. Looking at predictive modeling on voter files, and I'll get into what I mean by that in a second, we were able to identify over 10 million registered voters, already registered voters, who list climate and the environment as their top priority, who skipped the 2016 presidential election. This was an election decided by 77,000 votes. Almost 12.5 million skipped the last midterm election. These are huge numbers of people who are already registered to vote. They're just not casting ballots in these elections. And I imagine many of you are shaking your head in frustration right now. And I get it. Like, yes, why on earth aren't these people voting? But as I just said, this is a huge opportunity because we live in a moment in time where it's become increasingly hard to change people's opinions about anything, especially climate change, especially environmental issues. But what these people represent are folks who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior change. They just need that behavioral intervention. And as I will show to you now, we are able to identify these people as individuals and then apply behavioral science informed messaging to change their behavior and turn them into more consistent voters. And this can have a big, big impact, not just on who wins and loses elections, but also on that voter demand that I was talking about earlier. Because even when, as I said, the right person wins an election, they still need to decide what to spend their political capital on. And until we start flooding the polls, until we start flooding the population of voters, not non-voters, but voters with super environmentalists, boy, is it going to be hard to expect policymakers to do what we want. All right, this is how we do it. It's essentially a three-step process: identification, mobilization, habit reinforcement. The first step, identification, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail in this, on this in the next few slides. We build predictive models that allow us to individually identify on voter files people with a very, very high likelihood of not just caring about climate, but quite literally listing it as their number one priority. And I'll get into how we do that in a second. But what that leaves us with is this group of individuals who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. The only problem is they're not voting. And so that moves us to part two, mobilization. This now allows us to be completely agnostic with our messaging. We no longer need to do issue education with these people. We no longer need to try to convince them to care deeply about the climate crisis. They're already there. We just need to get their rear ends out the door on election day. And so what we're able to do is run hundreds of randomized control trials, testing which messages work best with which subpopulations of these non-voting environmentalists to do just one thing, and that is turn them into better voters. And we've got thousands of volunteers around the country who canvass, call, mail, and send digital ads, all with this optimized messaging designed to turn these non-voters into voters. And then finally, the third step is habit reinforcement. I don't think you need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that you can't change someone's behavior by parachuting in once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. It's not just how it works. And so what we do is we work year round in federal, state, local, primary, general, special elections, dozens of elections that have nothing to do with environmental policy making. But we still talk to these voters because any election is a precious behavioral intervention opportunity by which we can start changing these people's behavior and changing their habits and turning them into consistent voters. And we take that year-round work very seriously, as you'll soon see. All right, I'm going to drill down a little bit on this first step, identification. What we do is we build predictive models. And I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time drilling into this, but I'll go into a little bit of detail. But before I do, I just want to say, this technique that I'm about to describe is the same way that most of the political campaigns that you're aware of are now targeting voters. So Senate campaigns, congressional campaigns, gubernatorial campaigns, certainly presidential campaigns. No one targets by demographic group anymore. If you still think that campaigns like go after soccer moms or NASCAR dads, like forget it. That's not how they do it. What they do is they build predictive models that enable them to assign individualized scores to particular people on voter files. And that's also how we identify these super environmentalists. And this is how we do it. We start by polling huge numbers of people. I'm talking about like 10,000 people per state, like huge, huge numbers of people. But we only ask them one question. We say, what's your number one most important political priority? And let's say we're polling 10,000 people in Pennsylvania, and 800 or 900 of them say climate, clean air, clean water, some environmental issue. It's then very easy for us to work with data scientists to start to figure out, okay, what do we know about these people? What do we know about these 800 or 900 Pennsylvanians who just told us that climate's their number one priority? And we look at voter file data and census data and other publicly available behavioral and consumer data. We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And maybe we can start seeing some hidden patterns and correlations like, oh, if you're a forestry employee, you're 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list an environmental issue as your top priority. Or if you have a new home but no kids, you're 6 times as likely. Or basketball fans are more likely than baseball, football, and hockey fans. Or if you subscribe to an exercise magazine, you're twice as likely. And none of these data points are predictive on their own. But when you start combining them together, boy, do they start to have a lot of predictive power in helping you identify who some other super environmentalists are, people who didn't answer our survey, but we can still find them on voter files. We can start looking around and say, gosh, it looks like if you are a Latina grandmother living in Allentown who bought a Volvo 8 to 10 years ago and subscribes to National Geographic, it looks like you've got at least a 90% likelihood of listing climate as your top priority. Ooh, and then if you live in the Philadelphia suburbs and you have 2 kids in the public schools and just bought an electric vehicle, you've got an 82%. And we find all of these groups. And it's a long iterative process. But at the end of it, what we're able to do is assign a probability score from 0 to 100 to every single voter in a state, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. And what you're looking at here is a distribution chart of every single voter in Pennsylvania. And as you'll see, millions of them have like less than a 30% likelihood of listing some environmental issue as their top priority. No surprise there, right? But on the other end, there are also millions who have like an 85% or higher likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. And when we test and retest these scores, they are frighteningly accurate. And so then, remember what I told you is the one thing you can't forget from this presentation: whether you vote or not is public record. Once we isolate these people who have a really super high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, it's really easy to just cross-reference it with public voting histories and figure out who are the super environmentalists who don't vote. What you're looking at here are the 42,067 registered voters in the city of Philadelphia who have a higher than 85% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they've never cast a ballot before. And again, not to be creepy, but we literally know these people by name and street address. We have phone numbers for many of them. And now this means we are able to deliver these behavioral science informed messages to them and not worry about convincing them to care about climate change. Instead, we just need to worry about getting them to vote. Now, again, have we spoken to every single one of these people and confirms that climate's their number one priority? No, it's a probabilistic model. But we've tested and retested that model, and what we are certain of is that each of these people have at least an 85% likelihood of listing it as their top priority, which is pretty darn good. All right. Next, we move to mobilization. We've got thousands of volunteers around the country who canvass, call, send postcards. Then we, as an organization, do digital ads and direct mail, all with behavioral science informed messaging that we've tested in randomized control trials, and we know that it works. I know I've said that term a few times, randomized control trials. I'm going to describe what I mean by it in a second. But simply put, we can optimize these messages so that we know that we are sending the right message to the right people and turning non-voters into super voters. All right, I told you I would tell you what I meant by a randomized control trial. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on this because next I'm going to describe to you what some of our results are once we find these non-voting environmentalists and then start messaging to them. Let's say we've identified 1 million super environmentalists in Pennsylvania who are unlikely to vote in the midterm. What we do not do is just immediately start talking to those 1 million voters. Instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into 2 groups, and about 20% of them we set aside in a control group. And the remaining 80%, those are the ones we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this behavioral science informed messaging designed to get these people to vote. Then the election happens. Now, for the 4th time, I will say, whether you vote or not is public record. And so when voter files are updated about 2 months after the election, we are able to compare turnout in our control group to turnout in our treatment group and measure how much we, the Environmental Voter Project, were solely responsible for increasing turnout. Because as long as that initial separation into treatment group and control group was truly random, and as long as the numbers are big enough to get statistical significance, we've controlled at that point for all outside factors, right? I mean, if the Biden campaign spends $1 billion in Pennsylvania, well, we've still controlled for that. I mean, unless they hacked into our system and decided to only talk to people in EVP's treatment group, like, we have controlled for that. And this is how we are able to measure, while controlling for all outside variables, what our sole impact is on turnout. Just last year, an odd year, we were active in over 380 elections, local, state, and federal. And in all of those, we probably increased turnout. But what we know for sure is that in the larger elections, where we could really measure with statistical significance in these randomized control trials, we were solely responsible for increasing turnout as much as 4% among our targets in local elections, as much as 0.8 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 1.2 percentage points over our control group in statewide generals. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying we increased turnout statewide. This was only amongst our targets. We're obviously not talking to all voters in Texas. We are talking to the low propensity environmental voters. But these are big numbers. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.2% could be in a state like Pennsylvania. And that 0.9 you see in Georgia, that was for those 2 US Senate runoffs that happened in January of 2021, where $1 billion, $1 billion with a B, was spent. Yet the Environmental Voter Project, spending only $550,000, was able to isolate that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout almost 1 percentage point among the over 300,000 people we were targeting. All right, I want to get to the end so we can get to Q&A. We are very, very proud of these results. But what we are even more proud of is not our election-specific results, but our long-term results. Because after those 2 US Senate races happened in Georgia, everybody else left town. Everybody else left Georgia. But the Environmental Voter Project, as I mentioned before, believes in habit reinforcement, and we work year round. And so we got right back to work in, I kid you not, the Griffin Judicial Circuit DA's race. And if you don't know what a Judicial Circuit District Attorney is, it's if your county is so small you can't have your own DA, you have to like get together with other counties and form a circuit and share a DA. That's how small an election this was, and it had nothing to do with environmental policymaking. But it had everything to do with changing people's habits. And that's why we pay attention to every election. And when you do that, when you treat every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity, it leads to long-term results like this. These are the 17 states that we are active in the Environmental Voter Project. You see the light green states we just expanded into last year, so we don't have long-term data there. But in the darker green states, we have now spoken to 8.7 million unique individuals, all of whom, by definition, care deeply about climate and the environment, yet were unlikely to vote in an election or we wouldn't have spoken with them. As of the end of last calendar year, over 1,030,000 of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal, their most recent state, and even their most recent local election. This long-term data is what we are most proud of. This is what it means to change the amount of demand from voters for environmental leadership. Now, before I close, though, I do just want to say this metric that I just cited is different from a randomized control trial. We cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we most assuredly are not solely responsible for turning these 1 million non-voters into super voters. But we're pretty darn responsible. I can tell you there's no other organization that's mobilizing environmentalists in these local elections. We are putting in this work in these objectively boring and often unimportant elections because we know that that's how you change long-term habitual behavior. We've gotten a lot of great press for our work. We are really, really turning heads with a lot of this data. But there is no doubt that the upcoming midterms are going to be crucially important. And that's part of the reason why we're having this introduction webinar right now. We are targeting 5.8 million already registered super environmentalists in the 17 states that you see here who have never voted in a midterm election or a lower turnout election. And so we have to assume they are unlikely to vote without an intervention. This is how those numbers break down by state. And as you can see, I'll just take Arizona for now. We have identified almost 250,000 super environmentalists in Arizona who are registered to vote, yet they've never voted in a midterm or lower turnout election. What does 250,000 mean in a state like Arizona? Well, fewer than 2.4 million ballots were cast last time Arizona had a midterm. So that means our target population in Arizona is so large that it would equal 10.5% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm. Just drilling down on some really tight and important states, you can see our target populations can make a big, big difference this fall. And so I'll close because I want to get to the Q&A, but what I want to ask of you is to make a commitment to make a difference. We would love to have you join our work at the Environmental Voter Project. If you are open to volunteering, boy, do we make it easy. I would encourage you to go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. You could sign up for a phone bank. We will train you. We will give you proven scripts that we know from previous randomized control trials increase turnout. If volunteering isn't your thing, please make a contribution. We can turn dollars into votes all the way up to the Friday before Election Day. If you want to spread out your support, you can do it monthly. But for now, I want to get to the Q&A. All of you have been very patient. I went like 4 minutes over what I wanted. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and try to get to some of your questions. So Shannon, what do we got here?
Absolutely. One great question that's come in is, can you speak about why we're in the states that we're in and why we're not in some other pretty important states?
Great question. So because we work year-round at the Environmental Voter Project, what we do not do is change what states that we work in based on what the current really important election is. And so instead, the approach that we take is we decide what states to work in based on the following 3 criteria. First, where is there a disproportionately large population of non-voting environmentalists? We need to have that like big fat denominator. We need to have that big target audience, or it kind of doesn't matter how good we are. I mean, if there are 20 non-voting environmentalists in Idaho and we turn them all into voters, like, who cares? Like, that's not going to change any policy making. And so that's the first criteria. And that's why, for instance, you don't see us in some very politically important states, like, say, Wisconsin or Minnesota. There aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. And so, truth be told, if you want to make a difference in those states, we're not the biggest bang for your buck. Whereas in a state like Arizona or Pennsylvania, holy moly, can we make a big, big difference. Second criteria is we are looking to change policymaking, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. And so there are cities and states where we have decided that the climate movement can make a huge, huge impact if we bring a lot of these non-voters off the sidelines and get them to vote consistently. And then finally, the third criteria. We need to have active election calendars every year. No matter how smart we are, and I like to think we're kind of smart, there's nothing that can replace the power of repetition. And there are many states who, for good government reasons, have gotten rid of their odd year elections. They've moved all of their local elections to coincide with their high turnout even year elections, which is pretty good policy, but it's bad for a voter turnout organization like us. So for instance, Oregon has lots of non-voting environmentalists, but we would only be able to talk to our targets twice every 2 years. Whereas in a place like Georgia, where they have elections every year and every election, special, primary, and general, also goes to a runoff. I mean, sometimes we can talk to our targets 10, 11, 12 times a year. And the cumulative impact on voters' behavior and stuff like that is just enormous. And so those are the three criteria that lead us to work in those 17 states that you see.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Can you go into a little bit about the differences between our different voter contact methods, which are the most effective, and other stats like that?
Absolutely. So as a reminder, we canvass, we call, we send direct mail, we send digital ads, and then volunteers also send postcards. And we don't just pay attention to effectiveness, we also pay attention to efficiency. And what I mean by those two terms is effectiveness is like, how high a ceiling is there on this intervention in increasing turnout? Like, how high can you boost turnout with that intervention? Efficiency is, okay, well, what is the cost, either in volunteer time or in money spent, to achieve that increase in turnout? And we track them both. The most effective intervention, so the highest ceiling on boosting turnout, remains door-to-door canvassing. No matter how fancy or modern an organization or a campaign is, there is still nothing that replaces the effectiveness of one human being talking to another human being in person. That is always the most effective voter turnout strategy. However, as you can imagine, it is wanting a bit for efficiency, right? You know, if you're one person doing a 2-hour shift, even in the densest of neighborhoods, maybe you'll be able to knock on 60 doors, maybe you'll reach 15 people. And boy, can you reach more than 15 people every 2 hours if you are on a phone bank, or if you are sending out direct mail or digital ads or things like that. And so the most efficient method of voter contact is usually calling or texting. We're not texting at the Environmental Voter Project anymore because of some mobile phone carrier rules that went in place recently. But that is usually the most efficient, those two things. However, they have really, really low ceilings on how much an increase on turnout you can get. Even the best texting or calling campaign can at best increase turnout 0.5 percentage points or maybe 1 percentage points over your control group. Whereas a good canvassing campaign, I mean, in a low turnout local election, you might be able to boost turnout 6 percentage points. In a big high turnout election, it's closer to 2, but like that's huge. The golden middle, where you've got good efficiency and good effectiveness, is direct mail, digital ads, and depending on the type of phone banks that you're doing, phone banks can achieve that as well. When I say the type of phone bank, we've found that the most effective phone banks are kind of a 1-2 punch, where you start with what's called plan making. You ask people to tell you how they're going to vote, and then you call them again right before the election, and you remind them that they made a promise to vote and vote in a certain way. And thereby you can kind of turn the act of voting into forcing the voter to decide whether they're going to be an honest person or not. And boy, does that drive turnout through the roof. And so those are sort of the perfect middle there of efficiency and effectiveness. Very, very good question.
All right, we've got about a minute left, and this question's come up in a few different ways. In short, Nathaniel, could you just give a couple examples of the types of messaging that we use, either that a volunteer might use or that we use in our other forms of voter contact?
Absolutely. And so we certainly stand on the shoulders of generations of academic giants. And boy, have the fields of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology really changed a lot in the last 20 years. So I'm going to tell you a lot about our experiments, but please don't assume that we are like unique geniuses who thought up all this stuff by ourselves. Like, no, we borrow from a lot of other really smart people. Now, I think we test more often than they do, so we're able to iterate really, really quickly. But these are the messages that we have found, or some of the messages that we have found work very, very well. And what most of them have in common is we are not trying to rationally convince people of the importance of voting. And so what we almost never do is say something like, you care a lot about climate change, that's why you should vote in this election because it's important for the climate. Like, no. The common denominator among most recent behavioral science experiments is that you should never treat people as rational animals, and you should almost always treat them as social animals and try to figure out, how do your targets want to fit into society, and how can you leverage that to change their behavior? Okay, what does that mean for our actual messaging? First, we will often, as I just briefly mentioned, try to get people to promise to do something and then later reminds them of that promise. That might sound like a very simple technique, and it is, but it relies on a lot of sophisticated behavioral science, because what we've come to realize is that one of the most powerful societal norms we have is that most people don't want to be thought of as liars. Even when you're talking to a stranger, most people want to be thought of as honest promise keepers. And so if you can get someone, even someone who's never voted before, to tell you, oh yeah, I'm going to vote, which most people will say because voting is also a societal norm that's viewed as a good thing, that's like a trap closing on them. And you can come back later and say, hey, Shannon, I just want to remind you, back in October, you said that you were going to vote. And we know it's important to you to be an honest person who follows through on her promises, and Tuesday's your opportunity to do that. And now, instead of me trying to convince Shannon of the value of her one vote over a denominator of millions, which is pretty darn hard, I've equated the act of voting with whether Shannon is someone who keeps her promises or not, which is much, much more powerful. Another thing that we do is we often use peer pressure. We will let people know how many people are likely to vote on their street. Now, is that like juvenile and pretty like obvious peer pressure? Yes, yes. The same like juvenile crap that you experienced on the 4th grade playground still works. Peer pressure gets people to vote. We will even send people copies of their public voting histories through the mail. And boy, does that increase turnout. The final example I'll just give, because we've been getting some really, really great results from it recently, is based on a behavioral psychology phenomenon known as loss aversion. Basic idea behind loss aversion is most people are more worried about losing something than they are excited by getting that same thing. So you might be more worried that you're going to lose $5 than you are excited by the idea that someone might give you $5. How does that fit into voter turnout? Well, as you can imagine, there are a whole bunch of people who vote in presidential elections, but not midterm elections. And so what we do is we message to them, usually with direct mail, and say, thank you for voting in 2020. Don't ruin your good voting record in 2022. The idea is we don't want to make voting in a midterm for the first time seem like this big new thing that we're asking them to do. Instead, we want to endow them with something of value, a good voting record, and present the upcoming midterm as like, don't screw it up. Don't screw up this great new voting record you've got by skipping this midterm. Don't do it. And that, I mean, that's part of the reason we got such great results in local elections in 2021. And we're continuing to see these great results in some of our volunteer postcards, which are based on this messaging this year in 2022. And so that loss aversion message also works extraordinarily well. But what do all three of these examples that I just mentioned have in common? They don't say anything about climate or the environment. That doesn't work. Because what you don't want to do is get yourself in a place where you're trying to rationally convince people of the value of voting. That's not what you want. Instead, you want to appeal to who they are and perhaps more importantly, how they want to be seen. That's where you can really change behavior. All right. We went 4 minutes over. Thank you so much for your questions. Please, again, join us. I know we build this as a no pressure webinar, and we truly mean that, no pressure. However, you wouldn't be here unless you cared deeply about the climate crisis or the democracy crisis or both. And we've got a very important midterm election coming up. And so we would encourage you, sign up for a phone bank. We've got over 40 on our website right now that you can sign up for. Just give it a chance. If you're worried about talking to voters, well, like, give it a shot. If after 10 minutes you don't like it, just hang up and stop. But what I can tell you is Shannon and her team make it really easy to get trained. And most people, when they give this a try, they fall in love with it. Because afterwards, what we'll do is we'll let you know all the data from your phone banking shift, how many voters you spoke to. And then after the election, we'll report back to you on how much we were able to increase turnout. And if you can't volunteer for us, well, if you can't volunteer for us, I would ask you to reconsider, really consider volunteering for us. But if you can't, consider making a donation, because there is no doubt that the next 4.5 weeks are of supreme importance. So thank you to all of you for spending some of your time with us today to learn about the Environmental Voter Project. And I hope you will visit us at environmentalvoter.org. Have a good day, folks.